Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that doesn't know how you pronounce Buttigieg, Buttigieg, either. And how are you, Rob?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm got a bit of a sniffle. I think I'm fine other than that. However, I've been up into Scotland and almost got caught thanks to Storm Ciara. In fact, actually, I did get caught up there and have had to miss work to travel down today. But it was a lot better, I think, than travelling yesterday, considering it could have been a 10-hour train. How has the greatest storm of our lifetimes, or maybe possibly the last 4 or 5 years, affected you?
All we've had is a knocked over wheelie bin and basically a lost recycling bin as well. No trampolines where I am as well, or none that I've seen. So we haven't had any come our way. I read a tweet this morning that said, no matter how stupid you are, don't worry that you're not as stupid as this Mirror journalist. Because there was a tweet that simply read, child's bouncy pad stops train running, or something like that. It's like, do you not know how to spell trampoline? Were you too embarrassed to ask your editor, so you just said child bouncy pad? Because it's definitely a trampoline on those train tracks. Yeah, we seem to be in like the eye of the storm, but it just means I need to stay inside and play video games. And hey, that's my secret superpower, so I'm fine with that.
The trampoline thing is kind of impressive. I didn't realise how many trampolines were in this country until I saw them on all the train tracks via Twitter. Some of them even whacked right into a train. It's quite impressive. You'd think people who spent a lot of money on a trampoline might tie them down or something. I don't know. Turn them upside down so they don't fly away. Was another suggestion I saw, but I just didn't realise our country was so full of trampolines. I believe the Daily Mash article was everyone in Britain either loses or gains a trampoline, which sounds about right from what I've seen.
Yes, I like that.
Yeah. But yeah, no, we've braved the storm. I think that's the worst of it done. Did see a bit of snow on my train journey today, but that was much further north than here, so I think tomorrow's going to be depressingly wet and very British weather. So, shall we move on into the headlines? I don't have a specific headline for tonight, so I suppose I should lead with Adam Hills's beard has been shaved off, and that's obviously the most important thing to happen politically in the last few weeks.
Yes, on a slight tangent, I would say that means that the Brexit process is finally done, asterisks, in the fact that we have officially left the EU through our withdrawal agreement. But we've done
Brexit. Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party have released a tea towel to that effect. Brexit is done. And it's got Boris Johnson as a cartoon or something. I'll have to find that tweet to throw in the show notes.
They did. There's a lot of god-awful Tory merchandise out there. They've become masters of the shitpost. I don't know if you need to blank that out or not in post, but they've become very good at announcing terrible things and having people pay attention to them. I think that tea towel might be something just to troll the libs, lol, lol, lol. And there was a lot of that kind of, what I like to say, bad faith arguments sort of being made around that time. There are a lot of people who seem determined to celebrate Brexit, not because it was happening, but merely just because they wanted to make Remoaners suffer. I think I'll try and start on the night itself. 11 p.m. January 31st, there was a demonstration held in Parliament Square where Brexiteers celebrated. Meanwhile, those Remainers decided to hold a candlelit vigil and say their goodbyes to the European Union. It was quite a wet and miserable night, but the turnout was still quite fair, I think. And out of that night came a load of bizarre one-on-one interviews with Brexiteers, seemingly to struggle with what exactly they'd achieved and what tangible assets they would get out of the whole process that we've been through. I don't know if you've seen any in particular. The one that stands in my mind was, I think it was somebody who was like with Janice and Glannis or something. I can't remember. It was a mother and daughter who had two rhyming names, and the interview seemed to just go on into farce after that. Have you got any Brexit night stories of your watching of the proceedings?
So I was in Bath, actually, not very far from where you are.
Very nice.
I was sat in a hotel room having a nice weekend away, and I sat down and I went, oh, that's tonight. I heard, I think, possibly a singular firework go off, and realised I should probably go and do. I realised I should probably tune into something, and the news was kind of just a bit naff. So that's why I watched The Last Leg, and I got to see Adam Hill's rather ridiculous beard shaved off as he promised. So that was fun. And Armando Iannucci was on, and he's always funny. So that was quite a good way to see it out. Really, they had, I've forgotten his name, but they had a comedian down interviewing people at the kind of Brexit celebration party, which hilariously had no alcohol allowed, and about 400 people by the sounds of it. So it was quite small. And various people kept going up to him and like chatting with him, and were obviously quite drunk despite the lack of alcohol allowed at this event. And that is very amusing, and I'd suggest people go find that and watch that to kind of see kind of how it's kind of a damp squib, because as I think we're going to get onto, this is very much a technicality. We're now in the transition period, and we actually have to do stuff now, as opposed to just saying we've done stuff when actually we haven't done anything.
Yeah, precisely. This transition period changes very little in the real world, I would say. So there's an article that was released by the BBC that I've included, and we'll include in the show notes, about 7 things that will change after January 31st and 7 things that won't. And the things that change include things such as like MEPs losing their seats. So yeah, we won't go to the European Parliament anymore. We knew that. Our passports will change colour. We get a new Brexit coin with that bizarre picture of Savage Javid looking like he's Gollum holding the One Ring.
Yes, I'll find that article as well to throw in.
And yeah, he's that the fabled Brexit coin that had to be made and melted down twice before eventually it could come to the world. A lot of political clout has been put into that Brexit coin, so they seem very happy that they finally got it. We no longer will have a secretary for Brexit because that's been handled. And the one sort of tangible thing that comes at the end of the 7 points is that Germany won't extradite its citizens to the UK because it's not technically a EU country anymore. So that's like a small bite of what Brexit would mean. But still, in this year transition period, other things seem remarkably the same. So travel, driving licenses, European health insurance card stays the same. Living and working in the EU, both UK nationals and EU nationals will continue to live and work as they did. Trade continues in much the same way. There's no extra checks or balances there. So if you're wondering why there hasn't been a big change, it's merely because those decisions haven't been made yet. They need to be made in some time in the future, and the time frame that Boris Johnson has set on that is within 1 year. So the big change will be January 31st, 2021.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not yet, but still close enough that it could be a problem if we don't do all the things we have to actually do.
Now, here's a trick question. So we were saying on this podcast when Theresa May was in charge that the one problem that they'd given themselves was that they triggered Article 50 too soon without sort of agreeing what exact Brexit they wanted to pursue. And that led to a lot of trouble further down the line. Now, what trouble do you think Boris Johnson has put himself in by declaring that he's going to get this all done and dusted in a year? I mean, it's pretty obvious to me. I just say that it took us 3 years to negotiate a withdrawal agreement, one that took a lot of blood, sweat, tears, 2 elections to sort out. The fact that he thinks he can push one through in 1 year, to me, seems a little farcical, to be honest.
He does have some control. I mean,
he has far more control than Theresa May did. Like, from a UK perspective, he is far more in control and doesn't have to do the parliamentary maths and arithmetic and, keeping all sides happy that May did. But he still has to negotiate with the EU. And as I've said in the past, deals like Canada's deal took 7 years to achieve. And that's something that Boris Johnson has came out and said on February 3rd, pretty much, 3 days after we'd left, saying that, by the way, we've got to negotiate a deal. This isn't over. And I would very much like a Canada-style deal, but I'd like it in a year. If I don't get it, we'd have to go for an Australia-type deal, An Australia type deal is kind of code for we're going to have to do a no-deal Brexit. Yeah, but nobody's saying that anymore because they want to. I believe the tactics from the Conservative Party here is they want to persuade the general public that the fear of a no-deal Brexit has been avoided. I think a no-deal Brexit was largely unpopular with the general public. That's why public opinion seemed to be swinging about, at the end of November when that seemed like a very real possibility. And when Boris was able to get a deal, that's when he got the Conservative Party behind him more. And he was able to trade on that fact that I will get Brexit done, but it won't be as damaging as no deal. If he goes down that line and we're still in this position come like November this year, then we might see public opinion change again. The hard work starts now, basically, and they've got to get it right. And maybe Boris's speech that was quite bullish, I thought, on February the 3rd, where he laid out his claims that, we want our cake and we're going to eat it too, and the EU having to come back and say, you're going to have to make some concessions. I think he feels he can be more bullish because he's got that parliamentary majority behind him. And it's a very different negotiating tactic than the one that Theresa May took on. How successful it is yet to be seen.
Yeah. And I think there's just a few kind of things to throw in, so we've kind of covered everything related to this story before we move on to our main story. So obviously a lot of places had to take down the EU flag when the night in question happened, because, either we're not in the EU or over in Brussels, they did a very nice showing of red, white and blue colours over all their buildings as they took down the UK flag, showing we're no longer part of the EU, even though we're still in this transition period. But I can't remember which council it was off the top of my head. It might have been Ealing. Oh, no, it was Richmond. It was Richmond Council took down the EU flag as we left the EU, and then immediately put up the Council of Europe flag, because we're still a member of the Council of Europe. Fun fact, the Council of Europe flag is identical to the EU flag. So that's now just flying in Richmond, which is obviously quite a heavy Remain constituency, being in the middle of London. So that's one thing I think we should touch on, just to mention that there's going to be kind of stories like that coming out for I imagine a few more months before we're actually really dealing with the nitty-gritty of what's happening with these deals. And the other thing that's happened is that the banks in the EU have taken, under the English option, it used to show the Union Jack or possibly the Union Jack and the Irish flag. Now they're just showing the Irish flag, as it's the one nation, I believe, with English as its first language, that's still in the EU. So when that appears on, that might look weird to you if you're suddenly banking within the EU.
I think the only other change I wanted to touch on as well was Scotland. They had a lot of flag debacles, and there was a vote in Holyrood to say that the EU flag would continue flying there. It basically went against the decision of a small council of ministers who said no, it should come down, but the Parliament voted to keep it up. And secondly, support for independence has risen seemingly on the back of us leaving the EU. A recent poll suggested that Scots would like to declare independence from the rest of Britain by a margin of 52 to 48%, because, as we all know, there are no other numbers.
Yep, no more numbers in politics other than 52, 48. Or possibly, as we move on to our main story, a whole raft of numbers.
Boy, yeah. They do different numbers over in the States. They do big numbers. So yeah.
Big numbers, the biggest numbers, the best numbers. So yeah, moving on from our talk of Brexit to our main story tonight. This is the reason this episode was delayed by a week, because we were hoping to come to you with news of the Iowa Caucus, which is the first primary election in the Democratic primaries season, which will eventually give us our new presidential candidate from the Democratic Party, who will then be going up against President Trump in the 2020 election. And there was no result, as the TLDR here, so we couldn't do that last week. So hopefully now, Rob, we have a bit more news for people.
Yeah, it's weird. Usually I'm scrambling to try and keep up with the news, to have the news sort of linger on and me sort of tap my foot and go, come on, news, let's have it. I want something to talk about, is a very odd sensation. So we can finally talk about the US presidential election, how that's going to go. I'm going to try and start with a bit of a look back at how the primaries work in general, because it's very different from our UK system and how it does. And it means that presidential elections stretch on for a long, long time. The actual election itself won't happen until November of this year. The fact that this process only seems to just be beginning now and has been years in the making before. I think we mentioned that when Trump got elected, he nearly instantly set up his own, like the Trump campaign for 2020, saying he was going to run again. Usually most presidents wait a couple of years before they do that, but the campaign has always been going with Trump. And if you feel like I do for the last 4 years, boy, does it feel like every day has been a battle and almost campaign mode. So it's almost a relief to finally have it here. So yeah, if you're okay, shall we dive deep into what the primaries are all about?
Yes, definitely we should. And it's just been mentioned in the chat, actually. One of the things that's interesting here to focus on is how the front runner, the presidential candidate, is selected in the US. And it is, I haven't compared it to every country in the world, but it's definitely more democratic than the things we were discussing with the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. So I think we'll put that there as a starting point for the conversation. How it's quite an involved process, isn't it? And it involves a lot of voting in a way that even if we had like 20 people trying to be head of the Conservative Party, we wouldn't have to contend with over here.
So yeah, I'll try and split it up. And like the first point is America is big, really big. In the fact that it's states, states can often have the same population as an entire country, and you've got to think of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party not being one unified brand, but 50 separate parties that have one in each state. So this is how all the parties are organized. And so this means that every state must individually agree on who they want to nominate as their presidential candidate. And they do this through one of two ways: primaries and caucuses. So I'm going to focus on primaries to start with because they're the most normal. And then we'll move on to caucuses, which is kind of the weirdest. And that's what happened that's what they use in Iowa. And that's why the situation in Iowa is particularly kind of weird and sketchy for the Democrats. So firstly, primaries are like normal election. Everyone gets a ballot and they vote in secret. You tally up all the votes and the person who has the most votes in a district gets the delegates. Okay? Those delegates usually follow a similar structure to the Electoral College and the way that those are awarded on presidential night. So, for example, a state like California will hold far more delegates than Alaska simply because its population is far greater. However, unlike election night, so when President Trump wins Texas, he wins all the delegates in that state. Some states will have different rules about how you divvy those delegates up, so some will award them proportionally. Based on the number of votes each got in a district, and others will decide, no, you just won that by 52 to 48%, but here you are, have all 32 delegates or whatever it is for California. Following me so far?
Yes, I think I'm following along so far, yes.
That's your primary election, standard election. There are two types of primary, so you can have a closed or an open primary. So your closed primary, you have to be a registered member of that party in question in order to vote. So I'm a card-carrying Democrat. That means that I can vote in the Democratic primary. The Republicans would turn me away at the door. That has its benefits because it makes it far more representative of the party faithful as a whole and makes sure that your active members, those who are going to knock on doors and canvass, they're the ones who are going to be most enthused about your eventual presidential candidate. However, it doesn't really favour outsider candidates, or those people who might not feel they're that involved in politics that they didn't vote last time. So, for example, somebody like Bernie Sanders last time in 2016, he was somebody who came from outside of the Democratic Party. He was an independent senator and actually had to become a member of the Democrats in order to be featured on their ballot. He obviously got a lot of support from new members who were excited about the new brand of politics and the way that it could potentially change the Democratic Party. But in closed primaries, he's going to fail to have that effect because those people might be relatively new to politics. They may not have even joined up with the Democrats themselves. They just know that they like Bernie Sanders is a guy. So it does tend to work against that type of candidate. Compare this with open primaries, where anybody from any party or independents, you don't have to be a member of a party, can vote. So this is obviously far more open and gives you a far more, it's probably the most, we were talking in the chat about how the American system is far more democratic than any other in the world when it comes to electing a candidate. In these open primaries, this is incredibly democratic because you're essentially having one chance at voting in your presidential candidate before you get a chance to vote again at the end of 2020 in the real thing. The only potential issue with that is that this is open to corruption in other ways. So you could be a Democrat and think, oh, I really don't want Donald Trump to win his nomination. I'm going to vote for the other guy. I'm going to walk up into an open primary and just cast my vote for the Republican that I think's absolutely rubbish, and gives my Democratic candidate the best chance of winning. There was a feeling that maybe some Democrats were doing this back in 2016, thinking, Donald Trump, he'll never win. If we go against Trump, then he'll, be the easiest one to defeat, and that clearly backfired. So it's a risky tactic, but one that could plausibly be made. So those are the two types of primaries that we've got.
Okay, so I think that's quite clear. But yeah, definitely a lot more voting going on compared to, say, a leadership race over here. I suppose moving on from that, what kind of primary did we have at the caucus in Iowa? What does caucus even mean in this context? Because I'm imagining that has other definitions outside of voting specifically in the Democratic elections.
Oh, you've caught me on flat-footed here. I haven't looked up. The Oxford English Dictionary describes caucus as. I haven't got that. You can do that if you find it.
As a noun, it means in some US states, a meeting at which local members of a political party register their preference among candidates running for office or select delegates to attend a convention. So that's what we have here. It also means a conference of members of a legislative body who belong to a particular party or faction. So you could have a caucus of just Democrats within the House of Representatives to do something like pick their, the minority leader or the leader of the House of Representatives, for example. And it's also, as a verb, to hold or form a legislative caucus, apparently.
That's a bad description, to use caucus in your description of caucus. Sorry.
Yes. The example text there is Republicans briefly caucused.
Again, useless.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I blame Google for this. It can also be a group within an organisation or political party which meets independently to discuss strategy or tactics. So that's just, I suppose this is like the old joke about scientists. When they say scientists agree, well, the minimum number for scientists to agree is obviously 2. So as long as I and another fellow scientist say something is true, then scientists agreed. That sounds very much like that. Like, is that just 2 Republicans chatting over lunch? Is that a caucus? It sounds a bit broad, but I assume there's kind of a more specificity than this definition gives us. Okay, so this is definitely that first kind of caucus.
Yes, and caucuses are separate from primaries, even in in a legislative sense. So, for example, the next round of voting, I think we go to New Hampshire, and New Hampshire has it written in its legislature that it holds its primary election 2 weeks before any other state in the country. Okay? Which is kind of weird because it would just take another state to say, we're going to hold our primary 2 weeks ahead of yours, and then you could get stuck in a never-ending loop. But the reason Iowa gets away with it is because it's a caucus, not a primary. And a caucus is essentially, it's the most involved and I would argue the most old-fashioned way of getting people to decide on a presidential candidate. You have to, if you go in a caucus, first of all, you have to be kind of like a registered member of that party. Secondly, you have to physically attend a meeting, and it's not just rock up, vote, and then go and do your shopping later. It's rock up, have a big debate where you basically are given a presentation almost from candidates, or you have a bit of a discussion about who you want to vote for, and then you physically have to walk into different sections of the caucus room to say who what your preference is and who you're going to vote for. And these things can take hours. And if you walk out in the room, if you've got stuff to do, your vote won't be counted. So I think with this level of participation, you're already seeing the type of voter who's going to attend these caucuses. They are very engaged. They have a lot of time. They want to... They're your diehard fans, essentially. So that is why the results of the Iowa caucus are particularly important. Not only is it first, so it gives us a good, general idea of where the election is going, but secondly, it tells you how much enthusiasm there is amongst your core supporters. So that's how the caucus process works in general. You split people up into each side of the room and you say, right, you've got support over there, you've got support over there. Now remember, in the Democratic field at the moment, they've got a very, very wide field. I think there are about 9 candidates still standing. Let me just check my numbers. So you've got 9 different candidates. So all these people split into corners of the room, and then they decide, right, are we decided if we got a clear majority winner or have we not? Or which candidates here are unviable? So, for example, the guy with 9 votes, he might have just 2 people sitting in a corner of a room feeling very silly about themselves because everybody else is in a different corner of the room. There is then a time where people get to try and convince others in the room that say, no, come to my candidate. He's the person you want to support, or she's the person you should support. They can essentially change their vote. It's not an official, you know how we've talked about PR systems in the past where people list their preferences all in a row. You don't necessarily have to go in there with a second or third preference idea, but it might be an idea just in case you want to change your allegiance when you find out that your candidate isn't doing as well as you first thought.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's there's a bit of peer pressure at play there, but also if you do go to the side that has 2 or 3 people standing in that corner, I think I'd probably, in that situation, be like, you know what, I can have more of an impact by going over to someone who's got a larger percentage. Because, 3 vote, unless I'm voting to show I absolutely believe in this person 100%, like some people do, instead of voting tactically, for example. But that's definitely a situation where I feel like I'd be swayed to vote tactically. I'd be like, I've misjudged this if this person's getting 2 votes. Yeah,
precisely. And that's the weird thing when you compare this to the primaries where it's a completely secret ballot. You can be influenced by other people. And that leaves like a whole different level of politics to it. And I think we saw that politics at play in the Iowa results, and that's what made things so confusing. So in the first round, you've got sort of 2 rounds. You've got an initial alignment and a final alignment. And Wikipedia has very helpfully provided a useful graph for the Iowa caucuses, which I don't know if you see on the Wikipedia website. You've got first, you can change the first alignment vote results by county, and then the final alignment results by county. You can see the colours change for each candidate. So what happened in that first round was quite interesting. I'm going to focus on maybe sort of like the top 4 to 5 candidates because they're the ones that really matter. I think anybody from Andrew Yang down, unfortunately, really isn't involved in this race and might not play much of a part going forward.
Yeah. Do we want to just run through those? Because I don't think we've touched on this really outside of maybe a bit of prediction. So we have name dropped in the opening joke, but we have Pete Buttigieg, I believe I've said correctly.
Yes, I've watched several videos before making this podcast, and I believe it is Pete Buttigieg.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, because I know some people were discussing that even this weekend. People were like, I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm like, I'm pretty certain it's this.
In my head, I've been pronouncing him Buttigieg.
Yeah.
Which,
hence the joke at the start of the show. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, why are people taking this guy seriously? He's called Butt, but hey, that's fine.
From the chat, actually, a Maltese name. So that's interesting because I think someone had told me it was Czech based, which kind of fit with what how I was pronouncing it, but that's good to know. It's a Maltese name. Then we have Bernie Sanders, who I think everyone who's listening to this podcast is likely aware of because he was there last time up against Hillary Clinton. You should at least be aware of who he is from that, I would expect, if you've followed the US at all. Then there's Elizabeth Warren, who is an older senator who looks very young for her age, I think is like the big thing that people keep talking about. They're like, she's done this big thing with selfies, so she's made herself appear younger partly from that, but also like if you look at Sanders, a man with white hair, he definitely looks like he's older than he is, and they're actually much closer in age than you'd expect. Then you have Joe Biden, who, as you said, previously a vice president. People know who he is. And then finally we have Amy Klobuchar, who realistically, other than her name, I know very little about, so I can't give a good summary of. And then, as you said, there was Andrew Yang, who unfortunately has not done very well here, but he was... is he a billionaire or a millionaire? I know he has a lot of money. That's kind of the thing, and he's like trying to go for a change in politics, but in a less Trumpian way.
Yeah. They all tend to have a lot of money. Like, having money and being a presidential candidate usually go hand in hand. So, yeah. Not rare to find billionaires and millionaires involved in the candidates there. So, going down that list, I think it's just quickly important to reflect on the political alignment of these candidates. Before any vote took place, in everybody's heads, I think it was a straight fight between Biden and Sanders. At least that's what the initial national polling would suggest. Biden had a clear lead just because he's got name recognition, which counts for a lot. He's a former vice president. He was, stood aside Barack Obama, who was a very popular president and one who, I think maybe wide knowledge is that people feel that if Barack Obama had been allowed to run for a third term, he would have defeated Trump. But the problem was last time that the candidate they chose, Hillary Clinton, was so divisive and maybe caused apathy amongst a large swathe of traditionally Democratic voters. That's what may have cost them the election. You've then got Bernie Sanders, who was the main combatant to Hillary Clinton last time in 2016, who promised a new type of politics and is firmly on the left of the Democratic Party. There, he's the one, saying that he wants like free healthcare for all. That's one of his big platform pieces. And unlike the others, although he has a lot of money, as like I said, if you want to become a presidential candidate, you need to have a lot of money. The majority of his campaign is funded by like local crowdfunders. He actively rejects the big donations of billionaires. I think to have one attached to his campaign would be a detriment. He wants to build this big ground movement, and that's where all of his momentum seems to be. You've then got Elizabeth Warren, who is to the left of Joe Biden, but not quite as left as Bernie Sanders. I think she would see herself as the consolidation candidate, as in if Bernie was struggling to get the votes, then she'd hope that Bernie voters would flock to her rather than going to a more central candidate. And then you've got the guy who I will, people have struggled on how to pronounce his name. It's Pete. You've got Pete, who is kind of unapologetically a billionaire and quite a centrist when it comes to Democratic politics. I can't stress that. I say I've looked very deeply into all of their candidates, but that's the impression that I get from all of them. And so there you've got your big four, and how they expected to vote and where they lie. So Joe Biden going into it as a front runner turns up in fourth place, okay, with an initial alignment percentage of 14.9%. Now, it's been said in chat that this year was the first time that once a candidate had at least 15% of the vote, that's locked in. You're not able to move from your corner once your candidate has 15% of the vote. So I imagine in a lot of precincts that Biden was shockingly unable to pass this first threshold. And people who thought, oh my goodness, he's my guy, suddenly got worried, and then they looked for another candidate to flock to. Now, out of the three remaining, I think it's unlikely that those central candidates would have gone for Bernie. He's furthest on the left, and it's very unlikely they would have gone for Warren as well, although some may have come across. So unexpectedly, you see people sort of realigning to Pete. If you have a look at those initial alignment percentages, you'll see that Bernie won the first sort of alignment on 24.7%, and then Pete was in second place, but he had 21.3%. When you move it to the final alignment, Bernie's moved up to 26.5, and Pete has moved up like just under 4 percentage points to 25.1. That's quite the move. And it suggests that Pete was maybe the centrist candidate who was able to take the Biden votes away, and Bernie was really struggling to take them away from the other people who weren't viable. And those who may have moved over in Warren candidate place is they simply couldn't because they already had 15% and they've been locked in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the lock-in part is interesting, and probably again, all of these systems have their own set of archaic rules that we've discussed, and this is just one of them. So, I mean, I kind of get the idea, but that could affect the result again, and so it's not as fair as it initially seems. I would suggest if there's a lock-in could affect people's decisions. But then I suppose you, as we mentioned earlier, you have this kind of peer pressure effect, and is that fair? It's just a bit. I haven't really come to terms with it yet because I only fully understood it when you explained it earlier. Just one quick correction: Buttigieg is the only person I think who is not a millionaire in the list of people running. He has a net worth of around 100,000, but also has a 6-figure salary. So he's not a poor man, but he's not a millionaire unlike the others. And that's one of his lines he repeats a lot.
That's really interesting. I assumed from the way he was talking he was one of the millionaires, but it's interesting to see that he's a more modest candidate. I expect that's where he's able to garner a lot of his support.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, if the article that said that did point out that because retirement savings and stuff like that are included in your net worth, there are some of these people who are much older than him who it's not surprising that they might sneak into being a millionaire because they're older. Again, that's there's often these kind of blurred lines on that, but on paper he is not a millionaire. It is the only thing I think the important distinction to make there. And maybe that affects voters' choice. Maybe they go, "Oh, well, it'd be nice not to have a millionaire in here again," or a billionaire after they've seen what's happened in the past. Maybe that's a changing in opinions. I don't know enough about what the feeling is on the ground to really draw an opinion on that.
Precisely. I think what we can know about the feeling on the ground is that it's clear that Bernie has been able to really turn supporters out this time round. I was talking earlier about how the closed primary really has a disadvantage to the outsider candidate who's not in the system. And I think last year Bernie would really have struggled at an Iowa caucus. So yeah, last time actually, in fact, let me scratch what I was saying. My theory, Bernie was able to drive Hillary Clinton quite close in Iowa. I think he benefited from it being really a fight between two candidates last time.
Yeah, the field felt much narrower. I think we knew there were two main candidates out of the gate almost, whereas this time everyone was kind of like, oh, who's going to do it? Who can get enough votes?
Yeah, and this time, it's clear that Sanders has got a very dedicated team behind him that's ready to drive people out to the vote, and he feels that this is his time. The other big takeaway is the underperformance of Joe Biden. It was kind of shocking to a lot of commentators that Biden performed so badly. There are a couple of theories about why this is. Firstly, maybe that his name being brought up in the impeachment trials didn't help at all. Even though they were trying to say that Trump had, used a fake scandal to acquire some leverage off the Ukrainian government, the fact that Biden's name was in those proceedings made it feel, to me at least, very like Hillary's emails all over again. So if you're going into a presidential election with somebody saying, what's the Biden's relationship in Ukraine, that's again something that your candidate has, as easy ammunition to try and fire at you. So that might be why some Democrats, edged away from him. The other reason might simply be what I like to call the Jeb Bush effect, which is in 2016, Jeb Bush was seen by many political commentators from a long way out as this guy is going to be the front runner for the Republican campaign. And his eventual performance turned into a damp squib that barely made it past the first few caucuses and primaries. I think Biden, like Jeb, might be seen as a relic of a bygone era, of a time where, politics has changed a lot since the early 2000s. And, I think it's fair to say that politics has changed a lot since 2012, the last time that Joe Biden was able to be successfully voted in as vice president. Do you really want somebody trying to bring that politics back, or do you need somebody who's going to try something new, like like Trump did and see if you can win an overall majority. That's where I think Biden loses some of his key support. And this disappointing fourth place in Iowa is one that it's only one caucus. It's bizarre to write off somebody after one, but it definitely puts him on the back foot. And that's the reason why these caucuses are so important. If you get off to a bad start, it can completely kill your momentum. And going into the next one, you either need a miraculous rise from the dead, or people might be already going, no, I'm sorry, I've got to take my support away from Joe. If I want my moderate candidate to win, I've got to back Pete because he appears to, because he won this time round. So it affects a lot of opinions that way.
One other question I suppose to throw at you is, so you're talking about getting away from like this older style of politics, maybe part of it. And so Obama very much kind of had this message of hope and things were changing. And it is there one, would you say Buttigieg is that candidate here? Or is it just that, do you think it's more the kind of middle of the road stuff? Like, does he seem significantly different in his policies enough from what you've seen? Because I know that like that's the kind of idea that Sanders is kind of what we'd say traditionally is a left Democrat, but like in the same way we had Corbyn over here being very left in a traditional way, and that didn't necessarily play out well. You could see that also as a relic of the old politics. So is there something different about what Buttigieg is doing, and also kind of the stuff Warren is saying, or are they? Would you say that's not really a distinguishing factor here, you think?
So first of all, I'd like to do some more research. I think I'm going to keep calling him Pete because I don't want to risk it on his last name. I'm very, very sorry. I think Pete is a candidate that is the guy you want to vote for if you don't want Sanders to get in. And that sounds negative, but I think there's a few in the Democratic Party who have the same fear that the Labour Party did in the UK, where they say, look, I'd love to do some of the stuff you're saying, Bernie, but I don't think the rest of the American public are ready to come along with you. I think your policy is too radical. Think of all the times we've tried to get free healthcare to the entire country, and we've been stopped not only by Republicans in Congress, but by several members of our own party from doing that. I think your program of reforms is far too radical. I think that the American public wants a more moderate candidate. That's why you should back Pete and avoid Sanders. Which is similar to what people were saying about Jeremy Corbyn before 2017, when they thought he was going to leave the Labour Party to rack and ruin. And then, surprisingly, in 2017, he got a result that proved everybody wrong. Now, of course, that soured in 2019, and it's foolish to try and compare politics between two different nations where, there's a variety of other factors going on. That being said, I do think that some in the Democratic Party are cautious of how radical Bernie is and will want anybody other than Bernie candidate to support. We saw that last time in 2016 amongst the Republicans, where you had the anyone but Trump. Trump was this big juggernaut coming up on the outside that nobody had predicted it would do well. And you had a very crowded central field who was all of a sudden trying to struggle to find their central candidate to keep everybody in line. This may be the case with the Democrats now. I think Bernie benefits from having such a wide field, which means that he can pick off centrist candidates one by one to his advantage. For example, if Bernie succeeds in eliminating Biden early from this race, then the Biden supporters have to make the decision, do they go Warren or do they go Pete? And if they decide to go one of those, if they decide to go Warren, then it's not so much of a step between Warren and Bernie. And there's already calls on Twitter for Bernie supporters to say, hey, if you supported Warren, that's fine and I respect you, but look, if she's starting to come third in places, do consider supporting our team. We're going to get a lot of the stuff she said done, and she'll certainly be better than Pete, who's far more centrist than the rest of them. So, this big battle for the soul of the Democratic Party and where it lies is, kind of in this Democratic caucus. And I think that going back to your original question, Pete is merely representing the establishment and what happened last time, and the fear amongst Democrats is that we tried this once before. We tried to run an establishment candidate against Trump, and it failed diabolically. It failed dismally. There was a rumor going round after the election. I don't know if you saw it. It was sort of perpetrated by Bernie supporters, or some bit of research that said, "Hey, if Bernie had gone against Trump, Bernie would have won."
Yeah, I saw a lot of that talk in the wake of the election.
The theory was that Bernie Sanders is able to talk to those people who weren't previously engaged in politics, much like Trump was able to talk to those Republicans who weren't engaged before. And that swell, and maybe his support, particularly in those states that were crucial to Trump winning, those sort of Midwestern states, Bernie could have turned those around and won the election for them. That may be the strategy they're going for now, but it looks like it's going to be a long, bruising fight, and until we've lost more candidates, it will be hard to know exactly where the Democratic base lies and who they want as their leader to go against Donald.
There was also I've just seen posted that on 538, the current odds suggest that no one has the second highest odds after Sanders. Although, again, like 538 is very good at updating its numbers as things happen, and so that they'll be trying to make a picture based on ideas about all the different states. And this, as we said, is just one state. There's a lot of things that are different about Iowa to some of the others. It's a very white state, for example, can affect how it votes. So this definitely isn't the final picture. There's definitely a fairly long process to go, I think. When do you happen to know when we knew for certain Clinton was going to win? Because I think that race was quite close. I don't know if this race is going to be less close just because there's a wider field and it will suddenly narrow, or if it will be as close to the wire as that felt from over here anyway.
So that's a good point, and I'm really glad you mentioned it, because it picks up on one of the things I was going to say that's different about this Democratic election than there was in 2016. So Bernie famously took the fight all the way to the Democratic convention, refused to back down, essentially, even when it was looking clear that he wouldn't win through the traditional way of the primary and caucuses elections. Because I don't know if you remember, during the time there was this huge scandal about the Democratic superdelegates.
Oh, yes. No, I remember that. I remember the basics, but maybe we should fill in the listeners.
Yeah, so super quickly, superdelegates are essentially members of the Democratic Convention, or sort of senators and House representatives who get a vote that is essentially the equivalent to one delegate from a state. So you could win the whole of California with 32 votes, but it would only take 32 senators to vote against that person to completely nullify that victory, which seems very undemocratic on the surface of it. The reason they have superdelegates is to try and balance the power of the public and the party, so it would kind of stop the public voting in a candidate that the rest of the party absolutely hated. See Trump circa 2016. That was why there were rumours in 2016 at the Republican National Convention that a lot of people might just refuse to anoint President Trump as the winner, and there were various scenarios suggested that subterfuge on the day, people could stop it and they could announce an emergency candidate and they could nominate Mike Pence but not have Trump, or this, that, and the other. So back in 2016, they had lots of superdelegates that were all expected to back Hillary Clinton, and some news outlets were showing Hillary Clinton with a lead that also included her expected superdelegate count, which made it look like she had a massive lead, when in fact the Democratic primaries and caucuses had been far, far closer. So to avoid that controversy this time round, they've done away with superdelegates in one sense. So they will rely on the entire nomination proceeding being on... they will rely the entire proceedings on what the public vote is. And then if there is a tie or if it's very close, that's when superdelegates will come into play. So they're more of a tiebreaker rather than something that can influence the vote. I do agree that back in 2016, Hillary Clinton did have a massive lead over Bernie in terms of the number of votes passed. But it was very bad optics for the Democratic Party to have those superdelegates included, and to see that so many were behind Clinton made it appear that it was a coronation and not a democratic process going on. There was a lot of controversy around the way things were handled back in 2016, and it was a really damaging, it was, in my opinion, a really damaging and bruising primary contest that probably did affect Hillary in the long run. Although Sanders eventually, came round and said, look, my supporters have to get behind Hillary, so much vitriol and bad faith had been created between the two parties. There were even those that, demonstrated at the Democratic National Convention that there was no way that they would support Hillary in the general election. They were Bernie or bust. That was a phrase that was used a lot at the time.
And I think you still see the ripples of that, because you hear people talking about Bernie supporters as that they're talking about that group of very angry people who went and were at that convention. And I've definitely seen it in kind of discourse online that people kind of dismiss Bernie supporters. They're like, actually, I quite like what Bernie's saying, but I'm not a massive fan of his supporters. And we had similar things over here with Corbyn, like, oh, well, actually, what Corbyn's saying seems quite sensible, but we don't like people in momentum, was often a thing I saw being said. So, yeah, that kind of can affect things, people's view on things even now.
Yes, and has it, particularly amongst the big party faithful. We saw in Iowa that very few people came over to Sanders compared to Pete. Is that just because Biden was the one losing out and not meeting the threshold, so more people went to their political their political home, that they're the one that they felt most politically comfortable with? Or is it because there is a genuine divide in the party that, there's, Bernie has a great core support, but there's no way that I'm ever going to vote for him if I really don't like him? How divisive is he within the Democratic Party? If he is to win, I mean, he is the favourite at the moment, so we have to take it as, a big possibility at that stage. How can Sanders unite the party in a presidential election? Is the next big question. That will, we're a long way away from it, but maybe his tone will change as the primaries go on and he's able to convince more people to come over to his side. That's something that's yet to be said. There's one last thing we haven't touched on, which is kind of the reason why the vote was delayed, or why it took so long.
We alluded to that. We mentioned that there was a delay. We didn't mention that at all. And in fact, I think describing the voting process may make it easier to understand this story, because I just heard that the key part here was that an app had broken. So I had assumed they'd actually been using electronic voting, which is not the case at all. This app is specifically the app they were using to send kind of the information back to Democratic headquarters.
Yes. So, and that is the information that was, who's switching from which corner to the other corner, and who's won in the, what are the results of the first instance and what's the result of the second instance when everybody's sort of like settled out. You've got this juxtaposition of a very old-fashioned, clunky voting system matched with a high-tech app that just sort of seemed to crack under the pressure of sending all these votes into one place. And it led to a very confused picture. Pete declared victory on the night out of nowhere, which seemed to shock a lot of people because he was in 4th place before this. So for him to come out and say, I've won, was odd and made people sort of doubt the process, particularly when you've got Bernie supporters saying, oh no, hold on, from our personal numbers, we think that Bernie won the round. And when you look at the results, you can see that Bernie was in the lead in the first instance by quite some way, and even and to make things even more confusing, even after the final alignment, Pete was able to win the most amount of pledged National Convention delegates because he won the votes in the right places, but Bernie had the greatest number of votes, over 2,500 more than Pete. So you can see why you had two camps both claiming victory, and without the final data to prove it in what is a very close and very complicated race, it just muddled the picture. And it made the Democrats look really bad. I think in a week in which President Trump got acquitted in his impeachment trial, we haven't touched on this much, basically because it was kind of a foregone conclusion that most senators would vote along party lines and Trump wouldn't get thrown out. But Trump was perceived, at least by himself, to have a victory there, that he's got this impeachment trial off his back. Take this along with Democratic chaos. It led to a tweet from Trump that basically said, you think these guys can run healthcare? These guys want to run healthcare. They can't even run their own caucus in Iowa. What chance do they have? So that kind of saying it was a good day for Republicans for that very reason. So the Democrats will be nervous about the next caucuses and the next primaries and will want to make sure that they can eliminate any voting irregularity in the future to make sure that they are seen to be the Democratic, I'm saying Democratic a lot, the most sort of, not Democratic in the sense of the party, but Democratic in the sense of the spirit, that they are the ones who are listening to people's votes the most and that their procedure is watertight, particularly after 2016 and some of the allegations that came then about how the process was doing. I know Bernie supporters tended to be very adamant that their candidate had won or had been screwed over by the system in some way. This time it really is the system tries to make sure that the most the candidate with the most votes wins. And in previous years, the Democratic Party would never have even published the total amount of votes that a candidate got. They would only have published the number of state delegate equivalents. So to have that information posted and shown that Bernie did get more votes than Pete, again, there'd be a couple of question marks about how fair is a voting system, really, if you can get the most votes but get too few of delegates than the other guy. It means that Bernie supporters will certainly be fired up going into New Hampshire.
But that is good practice for how the Electoral College works, so you never know. Maybe both systems need changing, but that's not our thing to talk about. I suppose that's more of that's for the Americans themselves to sort out. But I know that's the thing people raise whenever things like this happen. You're like, really, the person with the most votes should win. The other thing I just wanted to touch on there was talking about, as you say, they both announcing we've won. It's very interesting taking this view, the longer view we try and take on this podcast, where we talk about things a little after they've happened as opposed to right in the middle when it can sometimes be confusing. On that night, everyone was like, oh, well, Buttigieg what a terrible mistake he's made, going out and saying he's won when there's no result and all of this. And as it turns out, I mean, on one of two metrics, he did win. So it doesn't look as silly now, but in the days, even a few days after the actual caucus happened, people were saying that he'd made a blunder. He's a young guy, doesn't know what he's doing, etc. All that kind of stuff. Turns out he was pretty close to right on that. So yeah, it's interesting how a week can, as we say, a week is a long time in politics, and it's interesting to see how that kind of plays out sometimes.
Yeah, precisely. And I think Bernie was going to be a front runner in this competition all along. It was going to be interesting to see who stood against him, and I think I certainly went into this competition knowing that it wouldn't be a coronation. Last time we were shocked because we expected Hillary to run away with it, and she was fought closer than anyone expected. She still won quite convincingly when you look at the number of votes that were cast for her, but some of the states that she lost, it wasn't the plain sailing that everybody thought. I think this one is going to be a battle right until the end, and particularly with the way things were run in 2016, there is a microscope on what is happening in 2020. Nobody wants to mess this up again, so that's why in particular it was the messiest possible start in Iowa. The good thing about the Democrats have going for them now is things can only get better. As the field thins, it will start to, the picture will become clearer, and I think maybe things might get to a little smoother once we're through the first 10. The big date for everybody's calendar is Super Tuesday. Super Tuesday is on the 3rd of March. So in just about 3 weeks' time, we get the big day.
It is Alabama, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Democrats abroad, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, and Virginia. That is a lot. Like, when you look at that as a coloured in map of the US, it's like a third.
That'll be the night that one of these candidates will hope they can run away with it. And maybe it will be, this is again conjecture, but I think Bernie lost out quite clearly in the caucus style of election because it was open for debate. Those who'd first backed a horse in Biden suddenly realised they had to change and chose another. When you've got a private ballot, when nobody's got that second preference, you're going to have to be, you're going to have to stick to that person. So when people don't have the chance of splitting or being convinced, Bernie may benefit from that as well. I don't want to sound like I'm coronating him before we've even started, but yeah, this is certainly the ball is in his court. It's his to lose at this stage. And we've talked about Bernie supporters and how they can be divisive, but on the other hand, he's definitely got a very willing fan base out there to cheer for him and cheer for him in every state. And you can compare this to the Trump candidacy of 2016. The big thing that pushed Trump over the line was that he had dedicated supporters who were willing to follow him to the end no matter what. No other Republican in that field was able to generate the amount of passion that Trump did. And I think I can say that that's firmly the same of the Democratic field when you compare them to Bernie. Bernie has the momentum behind him. Now it's just a question of if he can capitalise.
So I suppose to wrap up, we're fairly early in this process, and I suppose March 3rd will give us a much better insight. We'll have a lot more data. So that's, it's probably 2 episodes away. So that can be, we can come back to that in about 2 episodes' time, I would imagine. So thanks, Rob, for joining me as always. Again, another quick note, no quick polls update. Still too close to a general election to have any meaningful polls for the UK. I think, as we said, we're going to focus more on the outcomes of that general election via what's happening.
What I quickly wanted to do was just change our quick polls update for the next few months to the 538 website. And
that's a good idea, yeah.
Yeah, their polling of the US election, or particularly, I think we'll just focus on the Democrats, although it's been posted in chat and mentioned. I just wanted to point out 2 things that I thought were weird about the whole process.
So do we want to have a look at, do you want the national polls?
So yeah, so there are 2 that I've got. So give me the Democrat one that we've got. Who's likely?
This is the Democrat national polls.
So who will win the 2020 Democratic primary?
Yeah, so in order at the moment, there's Biden on 22.2%, Sanders on 22.1%. Biden has had a bit of a drop there, presumably following the Iowa results. Sanders has had a tiny boost. Then you have Warren, who hasn't really changed at 13.3%, Bloomberg on 11.8%, and Buttigieg on 8.8%, which is interesting considering Bloomberg got like nothing in the Iowa votes, but we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think in that instance, Bloomberg is a figure who's noticed, who has a name that you recognise, so he's likely to be picked up in national polls. Again, Buttigieg is somebody who would be a relative outsider, and it might be that he made his name in this Iowa caucus, so he might go up the rankings a lot. But I doubt that Biden will keep that position. Looking at their sort of polls tracker, the one that we mentioned earlier, the latest odds, I've got Sanders on 46% and no one on 24%. Biden's still in third, but his star has fallen somewhat since the results of Iowa, which suggests that his campaign may be in freefall at the moment, and the rest will be struggling to pick up. One interesting point I heard was that Andrew Neil, the guy on the telly who does the shouty interviews, who I also want to mention is chairman of The Spectator, which is quite a right-wing magazine, said that a senior Democratic source had said to him that if Sanders wins, it's over. We won't win this election. We need the we need the economy to tank between now and November, or we don't stand a chance. Which I thought, oh, okay, that's quite shocking. Let's just have a look at the national generic ballot in general, seeing where people lie on, do they like the Republicans or the Democrats? So with somebody saying that, I would expect the Democrats and the Republicans to be really close in the generic ballot. Like, the results since January 27th to February 4th have had the Democrats up by about 6 to 7 points. The Democrats are on 48%, the Republicans 41%, which to me seems absolutely bizarre given the narrative that's portrayed in the media, or certainly how it was in my head. In my head, it was like a bit doom and gloom, like, oh, probably Trump's going to win again and there's nothing we can do to stop it because the Democrats are messing this up again. We'll sleepwalk into another 4 years of Trump presidency, which was what was in my head. And for that to happen, I thought that the Democratic and Republican general ballots would be quite close. But to see it that far apart is shocking to me. And I don't know if those things are likely to tighten. You know, polls do tend to tighten as you get closer to polling day. But as a snapshot from far out, I'm not quite sure why the Democrats aren't feeling more bullish about their chances in this presidential election.
Do you happen to know if there's a difference between Democrats and Republicans on how many voters, like what percentage of registered voters actually go out and vote? Because all of those polls, from what I can see, are based on registered voters as opposed to likely voters, which is also available in the key. So it could be that maybe there's an expectation that less Democrats actually go out and vote. I don't know if that's true.
It's possible. And last time, one of the big factors in 2016 was the amount of registered voters that actually turned out. One of the reasons that Hillary lost was she failed to get out the vote that Obama did, particularly amongst Black Americans. I know that on the eve of the forecast, a number of websites basically said, look, if these people turn out, we'll be fine. If these people don't turn out, then Trump's going to win. And those people didn't turn out. They were turned off by the Hillary scandals, or for whatever reason, Hillary didn't garner the same report amongst the same sort of coalition of Democrats that Obama did. And Trump was equally able to awaken a new brand of voter in, a person who had felt alienated from the system for years and years, finally found someone in Trump who they thought could get things done, drain the swamp, build a wall, etc., etc. So there was that unique cocktail of things. Going into this election, I feel that more of those Trump voters will now be registered voters. So he's already got his people. Now we're back to seeing if those people that didn't vote last time, Democrat, if they come back. So I actually think that's like an advantage for the Democrats, that they might have, more people to add to that bucket than the Republicans do this time. But we'll have to see.
So, I mean, people who did not like Trump, but then thought, oh, well, Trump would possibly win, and then have suddenly decided to register in the wake of that, perhaps.
Yes.
But we'll have to see where we stand later on in the election cycle. I think it's probably too early to call at this point. So, we've done that. We've done a quick polls update, but on the US polls. I mean, again, I'd like to apologise for what my voice has been like this evening, still suffering with a bit of a cold. I hope that hasn't put people off too much. I think, as always, it's nice to take a bit of a jump away from Brexit, even if Brexit is still kind of touching into the headlines, and look at something else for a bit. As always, you can find us in all of the usual places. You can find us at parliamentary.observer. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language, and you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at unparlpodcast. If you like what we're doing here with all the different shows at TTSS, feel free to throw some money our way over on patreon.com/TTSS. One thing I'm working on at the moment, I've got someone who's been working on some new shiny logos for us. Probably hasn't escaped people's notice that Burko's gone, so maybe our Burko-centric UL logo needs a change. But I've got someone who's working on a number of different logos. We're trying to unify all the TTSS podcasts with like a set of kind of similar logos, which should be interesting. You'll see that appear in your feed at some point. That's one of the kind of things we can do with this. And again, being able to send out microphones to the other hosts to improve audio quality, stuff like that has all been very good. And also just keeping the website ticking along. So feel free to pop over there. And you can also find a Discord link in our show notes where you can listen to us recording the shows live. And we always have some people in the chat So that's always fun. I suppose other than that, there's not much for me to say right now other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.